Yo, this is weird. So as you can probably tell by the title of the video, my car isn't in the best shape. To give you a bit of background, I'd probably had the car just under a month when it broke down. I was driving on the motorway and it said engine malfunction, service now. Then a few seconds later the EML and coolant light came on and it lost power. I got it towed to the nearest Ford garage. They called me and said they read the codes and the engine had overheated. They quoted me around £950 just to strip the engine, and they said it was highly likely there was going to be more damage, so I'd incur further costs. I asked to be emailed a quote for the worst case scenario, which would have been a new engine, and it came to 8k. I assume that's on top of the initial cost as well. So I decided the only logical option for someone who works with computers all day, and has basically zero mechanical skills or experience, was to do the work myself. My vast mechanical feats include, and are limited to, clamping my exhaust back together when it blew, replacing an O2 sensor, also a wiper motor, and I helped my mate replace my broken suspension spring. I thought it might be interesting to document the process, but if not, at least have some good reference photos when I need to put everything back together. So this is my first time looking over the car since it's been recovered back from the garage. The first thing I did was pop the bonnet and check the fluids. As you can see here, the coolant level is well below where it should be. I know for a fact I topped it up the day before it broke down because it was just starting to hit the minimum line. Just checking the oil cap here, I'm just looking for any sort of cloudiness or anything to indicate that coolant had mixed with the oil, and the same with the dipstick, but to my untrained eye it all looked clear and the oil looked at the right level. I felt comfortable starting the car. I know it had been started at the Ford garage. According to Ford, the engine bellows smoke out the back of it when started. You'll see in a second there's definitely white smoke, but considering it's 6 degrees outside, some of it's bound to be condensation. I didn't want to leave the engine running too long as it's obviously low on coolant. I watched a great video on diagnosing an overheated engine, which my plan of action is heavily based off. On top of the visual checks, I did a smell test, which was a waste of time because I don't have a clue what I'm smelling for. I'll be checking the spark plugs, running a compression test, draining the car's fluids, and then from there going to start stripping down the front of the car. This should make life a little easier when I eventually have to strip or remove the engine. I'm just popping the clips that are holding the wires to the coil packs. They're also held in by two 8mm bolts. Once the bolts are removed, you can pull the coil packs upwards. This will give you access to the spark plugs. Then it's just a case of repeating it 4 times for each of the cylinders. With the coil packs removed, it was just a case of getting to the spark plugs. I had to buy a special thin-walled socket to get to them. I'll put up a picture of the spark plugs in a second. They all look pretty different to me. I'm not sure if that's an indication of engine health or if maybe the spark plugs are different ages. If anyone in the comments has any ideas, please let me know. To compression test the engine, I removed the fuel pump fuses. Annoyingly, in the owner manual there were multiple. I took them all out to be safe and the car wouldn't even crank, so I ended up putting them back and I removed fuse 34 out of the engine fuse box. I noticed some water or liquid in cylinder 4, so before I did the compression test I wanted to crank the engine a few times. After cranking the engine a few times I could smell fuel in the engine bay, which made me a bit nervous, so I decided not to proceed with the compression test at that time and move on to something else. was going to talk through all the bolts I was taking out, but then I realised mine was just a mess of random bolts, screws and plastic clips. The good news is all the bottom bolts on the bumper were missing, so it came apart a lot easier. I'm just spraying the 3 bolts between the bumper and the wing with WD-40 since they were caked in crap and pretty corroded. My mate Joe swung by to say hello and ended up out of the car giving me a hand. The bottom 2 bolts were a pain, but you could just about get to them with a swivel and a slightly longer socket. I did some research and figured that the smell of fuel is probably just residual fuel in the system, but even if the fuel pump was firing, people do a compression test like that anyway. A compression tester checks the engine health by measuring the pressure when the engine is turned over. In a healthy engine, the pressure readings across all the cylinders should be consistent. So here I'm just screwing the compression tester into the spark plug hole. Since I was on my own, I taped the compression tester so I could just about see it through the windshield. To do the compression test, I put my foot all the way to the floor in the accelerator and the clutch, and then pressed the start button to crank the engine a few times. You can see here that the compression reading for cylinder 1 is about 165 psi. And then you just press this button to release the pressure and unscrew the compression tester. So as you just saw, the compression tester literally popped off cylinder 2. I'm not too sure what caused this. My initial thoughts were I hadn't tightened it enough, so I moved on to 3 and 4 to see if they had any issues. Cylinder 3 gave me a reading of 150 psi. At this point my mate Harry was over, so it was a lot easier to record the compression test with cylinder 4. This cylinder gave us the highest reading yet of somewhere in the high 180s. The variance in my readings is outside the accepted 10 to 15%, which is concerning. However, keep in mind, I'm using a cheap tester and it is my first time doing it. And once again the compression tester in cylinder 2 popped out. We made sure it was on tight, and the compression tester can't be faulty because it tested the other ones. So I'm kind of leaning towards it being an issue with the threads in cylinder 2. I think it's unlikely it's got super high compression. It's not really something that's super common either. Another thing I was thinking is I've seen a video where the head is actually cracked at the spark plug wall, so that made the spark plug loose. My spark plug was in quite tight, but yeah, it was just something to think about. It's also interesting to look back at the spark plugs, and on cylinder 2 you can see the residue goes a lot higher on the threads than the other spark plugs. I'm not sure if this is anything yet, but I'm definitely keeping it in mind going forward. To drain the coolant, it was just a case of removing the hose clamp and then pulling the coolant pipe back. I also removed the coolant lid so it would drain faster. I managed to drain about 2 litres, which is about half the recommended amount, which seemed low even though some will be left in the system. Next I continued stripping down the front of the car. You might be wondering why I haven't drained the oil yet. The ground outside looks solid, but if you apply too much pressure to one spot it starts breaking apart. I'm not sure if the landlords paid it themselves, but I'm trying to avoid jacking up the car too much to prevent any issues. And once the rad pack is removed, it'd be easy to access the oil drain plug under the car, which I was planning to do anyway when I started stripping the engine. Here I'm disconnecting the battery and all the bolts holding it in. I loosened both hose clips on the induction tube and pulled the red tab up and the connection off. To remove this tube you just squeeze the top and bottom end together, just be careful not to damage the O-ring inside, and at the bottom there's a hose clamp. I wanted to take the top of the airbox off but all the screws were stripped. Luckily mine was aftermarket and it meant I could actually pull it straight up, so all I had to do was remove the torque screw at the front. And again my mate Joe was over, so he gave us a hand pulling off the induction pipe and we just lifted it straight up. Next up was removing anything connecting the rad pack to the front of the car. Just removing this connector here. There is some plastic clips you can disconnect, but I thought it easier just to remove the two screws as one was already out. Here I'm just removing any plastic clips connecting the wiring to the cooling fan. Just removing this coolant hose at the top of the radiator. Again, it was just a hose clamp. I'm just prying off the intercooler pipe. The driver's side came off quite easily, but the passenger side was a bit more of a headache. I ended up removing it from the other end. It's important to mention, since I'll be fully removing the rad pack from the car, I had someone come out and degas the aircon unit. The crash bar has 4 bolts on either side that need to be removed, and then I'm just lifting the rad pack up and balancing it on some jack stands and a few other things. The rad pack is still connected to the car by a few electrical connectors and the aircon lines. It was just easier to remove it away first to give myself better access, in particular to the aircon line at the bottom. It was a bit awkward to get to. Then it was just a case of removing the last aircon line and the final electrical connector, and I could pull the rad pack away from the car fully. Now it was super easy to access the oil drain plug without jacking up the car. Annoyingly, the person before me had put it on pretty tight, so it was a bit of a headache to get off, but I did get there in the end. I did a great job of covering up the camera when I removed the drain plug, but here you can see the oil is draining, so I just removed the cap just so it was a little bit faster. To me, the oil looked fine. It didn't look too old, and I couldn't see any metal shavings or anything in the oil drain pan. Since the compression test was inconclusive, I followed the Ford dealer's plan and removed the cylinder head. I'm hoping to determine the extent of the damage from overheating and what actually caused it. Let me know if you're at all interested in seeing this, as filming and editing takes longer than actually working on the car, and my main focus is getting it back on the road ASAP. Anyway, cheers for watching and have a class weekend.